All right, last time we went through the rigmarole of validating dates. Remember, it was fairly complicated. First, wanted to replace all the slashes and, pardon me, all the dashes and dots with slashes because when we do an is date or we try to do a conversion of a date, any dashes cause trouble. So by taking them all out, we save ourselves a little bit of grief. Dashes and dots, put some slashes in, and then check to see if what the user typed is a date. Is date works well with slashes, not with that other stuff. If it is a date, then we format it into ISO date format and then compare it to our mins and maxes. Because when we do the ISO date, then we get the year, the dash, the month, the dash, the day. And when you compare those, even as strings, they work properly for greater than, less than. And that's a little bit of an improvement over last year. So this again is a regular expression that does a global replacement of any one of a dash or a dot. The backslash here is the escape character. The dot has special meaning. The backslash says no, it doesn't. So replace dots with slashes. The G says do them all. So it's something we'll see again in the next unit. We didn't quite finish that though. The last thing we need to do here is return the error.style.visibility. Is that equal to hidden? That's how we tell whether or not this field is valid. Moving into today's notes, the next thing we want to do is work on our key press events. The key press events are already available to you. They're hiding inside my folder. Okay, so in the Volcker Tools folder, there's a currency key press, there's a decimal key press, there's an integer key press, and then there's a number key press. I'm going to have to look at that one someday when I have a spare minute to figure out why it's different than the others, because decimal ought to cover us for anything that has decimal places. Okay. All of these allow you to type commas, I believe. So all we really have to do, since I've already included all of these, is simply incorporate them where I want them. So I'm going up to form load, and I'm going to start now validating the currency field. So I'm going to create another variable called PTR currency, make that equal to the currency text box. And while I'm at it, I'm going to put a min and a max on those. PTR currency dot min equals 0. Max is 1,000. Let's make it 1,500. I'm going to validate it. That doesn't exist yet, but it will. And I want to do a key press event on it. That's a PTR currency dot on key press equals currency key press. Currency key press is the function that's embedded inside my currency key press JS file. Take a quick look at it. Lots of comments, right, but here's how you link to it. And inside here we can select, it messes with selected text to some extent, but it allows commas and decimal places and dollar signs. If there's a dollar sign that only allows you to put one in, it's fairly intelligent. So now whenever we hit that field, we should get the key press. Now there is no validate currency, so I need to write that real quick. And I'm actually going to steal validate number because it's very similar. Remember Alt-1 collapses to the function names. And a lot of this should be recyclable, so I'm going to copy it for currency. These pointers need to point to text currency and ERR currency. If it's not the empty string and if it's not a number. Now this one, this not a number validation now goes away. Has to be a number, because I'm using keypress to prevent anything but currency symbols from going in there. So it has to be a number. So my if statement goes away. And that means this stuff can unindent, and there's an end if that goes with it. If the pointer is not the empty string, it's already valid. Well, it might not be in range, excuse me. Okay, these come back words, indenting wise. So if it's not blank, because of key press event, if it's not blank, then let's parse the entered value. However, remember programming logic beginning, and all my lab assistants are probably very familiar with this. If you format a field and allow dollar signs and commas, int parse is not, or parse int is not going to work. So we first have to unformat it. I also have an unformat available to you here. Actually, it's part of format number, which is also included as one of my include files. If you format a number for G, that's the general format, it strips out all the excess junk. Format number also has a C and an N and a P, just like it does in C#. But I wrote the G version built into format number so that we can use it to unformat numbers as well. When you format for general, you unformat. So that strips all the stuff out first. Then I parse it into a number. It must be a number. I suppose it's possible for them, and maybe that's something we should be checking ahead of time as we format it before we check to see if it's empty. But if the user goes to the trouble of entering a comma and a bunch of dollar signs but no numbers, after we parse, there won't be anything left. And they'll probably get yelled at because the empty string should be considered less than, or actually that parsing would parse to something that's less than the min. So it should be okay. We'll try that just to see what happens. So we unformat it, then we check to see if it's in range. If it is, then we say the current or the value must be between, that's fine. And then finally here, it's valid. Okay, if it's valid and it's a currency field, let's format it. To format it, we simply set the pointer value equal to format number of pointer value. Format it however you want, which in this case is currency. So when you do these, there should be a lot of cutting and pasting. If I were you, I'd be cutting and pasting from here. Change some of the function names, so because mine right now are very generic. Change the function names, change the field names, but a lot of the logic is very, very similar. I think we've got everything we need here, so let's test it. Something in there to keep it quiet. Now I come over here and oh darn, that didn't work. Something's wrong. So we turn the bug on, and while I remember, add it to the recording. Today, Paul was having some trouble with the debugger in Firefox. When the Firefox debugger hits a document.writeLine, it basically stops, ignores all breakpoints. I think that's because the document that we were inside of has changed. And so the document.writeLine basically null and voids any breakpoints you have in your program. So if you have some document write lines and you need to debug in that neighborhood, document out or comment out those document write lines while you're debugging and then put them back in again. Okay, so what's wrong here? Firebug is telling me there's no problems. Better refresh the page. And yes, there is. PTR currency. Never heard of validate currency. Did I forget to? Oh, long V. Okay, save. Refresh again. Now it's clean. Click inside here, and if I take all that stuff out, I can't put it back. There we go. So now KeyPress is doing its job, though I can type. Well, first of all, let's just put in a decent value, 1, 2, 3, 4. When we leave, that should be formatted. And it is. And now if I want to come in here, I can edit it. And normally at this point, if I leave this field, parse it, sees the dollar sign, so that's not a number, and it quits, turns that number into 0. But because we unformatted it first, that'll strip out the commas and the dollar signs, and it should retain its value. Put an extra couple of decimal digits on there, it'll strip them off because we're formatting on the way out. So that seems to be working. It's formatting on the way out, and it's reading them, and probably should check the validation, but I don't think my currency KeyPress allows a minus sign. It does not. Okay, so it can't be negative, so we really didn't have to check to see if it's greater than or equal to 0. Maximum was 5,000 or 1,500. Uh-oh. Didn't we say the max was 1,500? Currency max. Maybe you can get a little error on rounding. There it goes.
Do you have to put a .00 in there?
I think it's when you leave the field. I think you're still in the field when you have one, so it doesn't pop up.
So it's just another double rounding error is my guess.
Is it because it formats it?
But when we format it before we compare it, oh, it's parse int. Duh. Parse double, is it? See why you test. Entered value equals parse double. It's not parse double. Are you smarter than me? Remember what it is? Guess I'll have to go look it up. Come on. And that would have been JavaScript basics. Parse float. That would have been my 70-second guess. There we go. Almost attributed that to rounding, but that wouldn't.
Can you go back to
Yep.
I'm getting an error saying cannot read property value of null.
A value of null?
Yeah,
When?
so if you go
When you end the 1,500?
No, if you go in the field and leave it and don't put anything.
Should be getting an error marker. Should get an error marker that says it has to be, you have to enter a value, but you shouldn't be getting a runtime error.
I'm getting an error only if I refresh the page. I don't have an error, but then if I click in the
Still have this if statement.
Yeah,
Pointer not equal to the empty string.
oh, this
Okay, while he's fixing that, the last thing I want to do is put in a comma, a dollar sign, and a comma, a couple of them. Notice if I try to put in another dollar sign, it doesn't let me. When I leave, I get not a number, and that's probably acceptable. Or I can modify my logic, because after I unformat, and maybe I should just unformat it up at the top before my if statement even starts. And then if it says if the pointer value is not equal to the empty string. But if you put in a bunch of junk, I think I'd rather have it say that's not a number. But that's only if they put in dollar signs and commas with no numbers at all. Because then it's not the empty string. So if you want to deal with that, I'll let you write the logic. I'm happy with this, that I get a not a number, and hopefully they'll look at it and get it sorted out. Questions on key press? Again, they're all the different types that you can apply. Format number can be used for formatting any number, and it does currency and can designate the number in decimal places by adding a number just like you do in C#. But we haven't seen, did we do title case? I think we did title case, didn't we?
Yeah, we did it.
Yeah, did that one for the other one. Okay, so the next thing we want to know is, all right, we got a bunch of radio buttons, in this case 2 radio buttons on the form. Did we pick any of them? There's a couple of ways we can check this. The first is to use a function that I have written, another one of my handy dandy ones. Let's go take a quick look at it. Get selected radio button. Get selected radio buttons uses a special function called get elements by name, and then we send in the group name. Now this is the group name of our radio buttons. So this gets all of them, creates an array of all of them, then walks through it and says if it's checked, then return it. But if none of them are checked, which is kind of what we want to know, then nothing gets returned. So we can check for that. That's one way, is to call this function. I think that's the easiest way. The other way that we can get that information is by doing kind of the same thing we're doing in C#. Every time the user clicks on a radio button, we set a class level of global variable and say red, blue, green. Well, if it's still the empty string, then they never picked one. So we create a variable like that. But then we have to create on-click event handlers for each one and figure out which one it was and set those, and that can get a little tedious. So let's try it with the if not get selected radio button group name. Now, how do we check for this? Well, when it comes to radio buttons, you're not going to check for that until it's time to validate the form. And so here's my validate the form code, and right now it's just got a commented out alert. And I'm going to return nothing. I'm going to return false right now. We're going to fix that later. False just means don't send this form to the HTML previewer thing. I'm not interested. Above this, I'm going to say validate the radio buttons. So I'm still going to write a function to do that. But I'm going to do it after I validate the form. I notice I've been switching to capital letters here where everything else is lowercase. I probably should be consistent.
Why are you doing it when you validate the form?
When else would I want to do the radio buttons? Because as soon as you click one, it's selected. But if you never touch them, and then you try to submit,
So it never would. No.
you'd never know. Okay. So when you write yours, try to be consistent, but I probably won't notice. It's so fuzzy when I grade, there's a lot of things that got to be slipping by right now. All right, so let's write another function called validate radio buttons. Bless you. Inside here, we need not a pointer to the value because we're not terribly interested in the value. We need a pointer to the error marker because I even put error markers on my radio buttons. So if you forget to select one, the error marker shows up. So I'm going to create a variable for the error marker, and that's going to be equal to error color. That's the only one I need. I don't need a pointer to the object because I don't need to validate the range, it's a number, any of that kind of stuff. I just need to make sure they picked one of these. Then I'm going to write, I'm first going to hide the error marker. err.style.visibility equals hidden. And then check to see if none of the radio buttons are selected. If selected radio button, is it lowercase s? Check the notes. Get selected radio button. And in parentheses, you then have to designate which group. Because remember, we could have lots of groups of radio buttons. Each one has its own name. If we look at the code for the radio buttons, they each have the name color. So that you have to designate when you call. Which group of radio buttons do you want analyzed? If there aren't any, then we set our error marker. And set its title. Now when I click test my form, we already have that wired and on load to validate the form. Just verify that. On button submit, on click validates the form. So we validate the form, we get to validate forms, we validate the radio buttons, so then we validate the radio buttons and turn on the error marker. If none of them are selected, we still return false, which means we don't leave the form. Later on, this is where validate form is going to grow, probably today. So I'm going to test my form, and it's submitted. That's not good. Turn the Firebug back on again. He is on. Nothing in the console, really? Probably forgot to reset that form. Where's it getting that information? Save it? No. There we go. Now, what bothers me about this is that the radio buttons don't turn off. You'd think as soon as I click one that this would go away, but it doesn't. So we're going to have to take care of that. And that one's a little tedious. For every radio button, we now need to define an on-click event. So I'm going to define it right here, RDO red dot on click equals clear radio error. Same thing for blue. They all go to the same place, but you still have to provide the event handler name. And I'll just tuck that under here so you can see that code as I write it. So function clear radio error. Nothing much to this function, it just makes the error marker for the colors invisible. Now I might, if I had multiple groups, I'd have to say clear color radio error or whatever you wanted to call it. But for right now, I'm just going to say that the ERR color dot style dot visibility equals hidden. Save it and check it. So one problem with not resetting that Firefox stuff. I'm going to turn that back on again. You have to close the form to reopen it to get that to happen. So I'm going to turn this back on, which resets my Firefox form. The only time I can remember where this causes trouble is if there's PHP involved. So we should be okay.
When you do that though, then your
Then
auto
what?
values don't go in.
Then they don't
Default
stay.
values?
Then they don't stay. Those aren't default values. Those values that were sitting in there, the SGs, are the ones I typed the first time I used the form.
Right, but I have the TXT username on Blur,
On Blur, all the on Blur events still happen.
not on Blur, onload.value equals gone with the win.
Okay.
When I refresh it, it's not there.
But I think all this reset stuff happens, the form reset happens first, and then we go down and change all the rest of that, so that shouldn't make any difference.
Oh, I got some errors.
Okay, so type some stuff in there, put some stuff in there. Now the radio buttons, I'm going to test my form, and I get yelled at for the radio button, but as soon as I click one, it goes away. Reset my form, submit my form. As soon as I click one, it goes away.
Hey, Volker,
Yes, ma'am.
I am getting an error when I press the submit button, but because it submits so quickly, I can't look at the error.
Do you have an invalidate form? Do you have a return false? You do?
Yeah. She said I have to pause it
What I would
so can see
suggest
the
is
error.
that you turn off or comment out the button on click validate form. You're getting an error when you click it?
I see it pop up in
Yeah.
the console thing.
Yeah.
But then
Does your form submit then?
Yeah.
So something's wrong in what you just added somewhere. So you're missing a curly bracket or I don't know.
I think it went away when I commented at the on submit, so
The error went away?
yeah.
Well, now it's not submitting anymore. So it's your radio button validation that's causing trouble.
Sorry.
Okay. So that takes care of the radio buttons. Ensure combo box or list box value is selected. First item in the combo box has value empty string. All right, so in this combo box, if you notice behind the scenes here, it's showing nothing. How does it do that? Well, the first item in the list is an empty item so that when it comes up, it's blank. Because remember when you put combo boxes in, let's select your favorite color. And when you put combo boxes in, the first one on the top is automatically selected. So in this case, I've put an empty one in, and some of you have said, please select a color. Well, you can still provide a value. I can put any text in here I want. The value is still the empty string. Or I could probably, I wonder if that's an option. Well, Now it says select your color, but the value is still the empty string. And so anytime I want to, I can check the value of that combo box, just like anything else. So I'm not sure I'm even going to write that one. When you leave, if the value is still the empty string, just like anything else, if the value is still the empty string, then you got a problem. If it allows multiple returns, you can check a length, but only if it's allowing multiple returns. Otherwise, we can just check. So let's do this favorite class instead. Make sure that on form load that we have a valid class as well. So let's validate the class. So here's my validate form. I'm going to validate the radio buttons, but I'm also going to validate the class or fave class. And let's write that one just above here so it's easy to find. And most everything's the same. Might as well just type it. wp10.5 equals the list box, which is lst fave class. Yep.
You just have like hold it in line 143. When you call the function.
Where I called it. Oh, okay.
Quick question. Why are we turning off the error before it goes into the if statement?
So I don't have to put an else clause in there to turn it off. If you wanted to do else error style divisibility equals hidden, that's another option. I've been trying to be fairly consistent because there could be 6 different ways to turn it on. Instead of turning it on in 6 different places, I only turn it on once. And then if everything's good, I turn it off. And so every one of my techniques, for the most part, sets it either to hidden or sometimes it's visible. But most of the time it's hidden and then I turn it on. Instead of having an else clause at the end, I just start with it off. And then if I find a reason to, I turn it back on again.
Okay, and then when you change it, it would run through validate again.
Going through validate again.
Which would turn it off.
Right.
Okay.
But we'd have to again create some code that validates that, maybe on blur. We could probably do an on blur for this as well. Right now I'm doing it in the form. I might have to switch that to on blur. Okay, so I test my form and I get error markers here, here, and here saying you haven't picked anything yet. When I pick one, that doesn't turn off. So maybe that's better to be a blur. So let's try it on blur. So up here, list favorite class on blur. Let's change this. So now it's on blur, so if I'm walking through my form, still haven't selected anything, I get yelled at. If I pick something and leave, then it turns off. But I have to leave. That's a little different than the radio buttons. And on all of these, if there's a currency problem, I left it blank, I put something in, leave, then the error marker goes away.
Instead of on blur, is it on like for this box?
Sure. So you could do it there. But one of the things we haven't run into yet is before we ever submit this form, we're going to be checking every single thing, right, to see if there's any error markers anywhere. And so this code that we're putting in here also works. It still works later on. We're going to be reusing this code. Okay, so list boxes and combo boxes, just check to see if they're blank. Form level validation, here we go. Call all the validations in an if statement. Well, if the problem with using an if statement, and we're talking about form, validate the form now. I want to go through every one of the validation routines and say, make sure everything's good. Whenever I call the validation routine, if there's something wrong, it turns on the error marker and it returns false. The problem is if I put them in an and statement, so if I did something like this, if validate radio buttons and validate fave class,
Is it and or does it use a double ampersand?
thank you. I'm into MySQL now, right? If validate radio buttons and validate class, that basically says they're both true. If they're both true, then we don't do anything. I'm going to put an else in here temporary, but what you need to recognize is if this one is false, it never gets to validate the favorite class because it short circuits. And I really want to go through the whole form. Instead of telling the user just kind of like what the form does, what HTML5 does right now with required fields. Hey, this is required. So you fill it in. It goes, hey, this is required. You fill it in. Hey, this is required. You fill it in. I'd like to be able to tell them all of them at once. Turn on every single error marker. So I want every one of those functions to get called, regardless if the ones before it have called. I basically want to turn off the short circuit. One way to do that is if this is true, curly bracket. If this is true, curly bracket. And you embed the curly, you just keep working your way down. There's sequential ifs. It's one way to do it. I did a little bit of research and discovered a short circuit AND function. You send this function as many function names as you want, and it walks through all the arguments, and it simply does them individually. Takes the previous result and ands it with the next function, ands it with the next function, ands it with the next function. They're not in a big long chain, so there's no short circuit. It instead walks through a loop and said, right now I'm true, and the next one I'm true, and the next one I'm true, and the next one I'm false, and the next one, it just keeps going, regardless of whether it finds a false or not. So we want to call this no short circuit AND. And that goes here. If no short circuit and then you simply send it all of the function names with commas, no ands, commas. And I believe I stuck a not in front of it in my logic as well. If it's bad. Or did I save that? I think I save it. After have each validation returned, we did that. If all validations successful, submit the form. I think I'm going to put this in a variable. Variable all okay equals no short circuit and of all the stuff. I'm just lining up this parenthesis because that's the other half of the function call. And we have validate currency, and the order here really doesn't matter much. And we have validate date. And I already have fave class in there. What else do we have? I think there's a validate value. You just list every single method, validation method for every single field on your form. If not all okay, I want to display an alert. Just to wake up the user. And then return all okay. So remember, this is validate form. If all okay is true, this is everything's cool on the form and it submits the form. But if all okay is false, then it doesn't. It's false and it stays here with the errors. Now technically, you really only need to do the required fields. Anything that's optional, if it's still blank, so what? It's got a bad value in it, it's still got an error marker on it. Actually, no, I take it back. You have to do them all. Otherwise, this won't display the alert and it will submit. Because even if there's error markers, let's say I have an error marker on my currency. And since it's not required, I don't validate it here. It's got an error marker on it. This is different than Visual Studio where we check to see if there are any error markers on the form. We're not checking our error markers to see if they're visible. We're simply validating every single object. Every single one of those objects returns a true or a false. We compound condition them together. If any one of them is false, we stay here.
So with the visibility equals hidden, how does it know if it's true or false?
How does what know? This is double equals. That's a comparison. Every one of those is a comparison.
So if it equals hidden, then it's
True.
True.
Which means it's good, right?
Okay.
So the way I designed this is that each one of the validation functions returns true or false. True if it's valid, false if it's not. Plus it turns on the error markers. Plus it sets error messages. And if appropriate, formats stuff for you. So let's
So
refresh.
in there, no short circuit and,
Yeah, the function itself.
yes,
Okay.
that function, so it's really saying true and true and true and false and true and true if there's a false in the middle, and then it evaluates the false because you have one false with all those ands.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just trying to,
Yeah, what it really does is it checks them each at a time and it keeps a running total. So it checks the first two. So it calls validate, come back down here, validate radio buttons, that's true. Compare that with validate fave class, that's true. The end result is true.
Okay.
Now it checks that against currency.
all equal result.
And if that's false, then the end result is false. And the rest of the time we're wasting our time, right? Because the answer is false. However, we still check every other function true against false, false against false, true against false. The answer is always false. But we check, the point is we check every function, which turns all the error markers up.
So the double ampersand is almost like an if result is equal to,
This one here?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like saying, to me, that's like saying if the result is equal to whatever argument you're throwing in there.
Plus whatever all the previous totals are.
Okay.
So result is modifying itself, right? And here's result. We put a true in there, and then we compared it to a false and put a false in there, and then we compared it to a true. Once it's a false, it stays a false. But every one of the functions gets called.
Okay, so result gets turned into false, right?
Yes?
Wouldn't that short circuit
No.
past that? Because
There's nothing past it. There's only one simple, every time through the for loop, there's only one simple compound condition. There's nothing to short circuit. The for loop doesn't short circuit.
No, I'm saying that what you have highlighted right there. It will look at result that says that's false, so it doesn't even look at the arguments, right? Wouldn't that be the case? To
That's a
me,
good-
it would seem
That's a good
like
question. I
that's
understand
the
what
case.
you're saying. Once result is false, wouldn't it short circuit this is false and that and never execute the arguments sub zero or arguments of whatever that is?
No, because it goes until arguments equals length. The length of the argument.
Yeah, but why would it? But if this is already false, it never executes that statement.
So
This may have been wrong in all my previous units and nobody's ever caught it before. So let's see. We need to find one that's false, but then none of the other, if the first one is blank, right, none of the other error markers, I'm going to start it right away. And it finds them all.
You get an error.
Yeah, because you're going until.
Validate value is not defined.
Might be lower.
Yep. Good news is it works. The question is why. Because I agree with you. It would seem to me that
'Cause
no
it's-
short circuit and as soon as it sees that this is false,
No, because the for loop, it goes through the for loop until the argument equals length.
right, but and this is not an if statement. That's the problem. That's why.
That's, yeah.
It's not an if statement. Right? If it's an if statement, it short circuits. This is not an if statement. This is saying this and that.
Okay.
And so it doesn't short circuit because it's not an if statement. And then the for loop goes through.
I might flip the arguments with the result.
You want to go ahead and flip them around. Put it first. It makes sense. Because then then you think it always executes it, but it obviously does anyways. Okay, so that's what our validate form did. Calling no short circuit and it went through every one of the things on my form that was required and said, hey, you're still missing these. And if there's anything wrong in here, like I make the number too big, didn't this have a maximum of like 25 or something? Right. Then I test my form, it doesn't take that error marker out. And I'm now getting double whammies because HTML5 is going, hey, this is required. We're going, hey, this is required. Hey, it's red. This is required. That ought to help. But can't guarantee HTML5, though required is pretty constant. But HTML5 required still only tells you about the first one. And I want to know about all of them. And that's why I'm blending these things. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll see what's left.